My name's Guy Kesterman. I've been a professional bike and kit tester for over 25 years. And this is my tech check round on the brand new Generation 2 Trek Supercaliber SLR in its flagship 9.9 SRAM XX SL spec. Now, there is a full live ride review, a proper lengthy in-depth one to go with this bike. So if you want to know how it rides and see that live on the trails up at Stainburn, then go and watch that video. This is all about looking at the frame features, the componentry, the geometry, and some of the other details that have come from riding the bike, and also some of the things I learned from a really interesting chat with Alex and Travis from the Trek team behind this bike. So, while it looks very similar to the Gen 1 Supercaliber in terms of layout and general frame shape, talking to Trek, it's clear that this is a totally new bike. Not only have they used some lighter weight, higher performance composite in this OCLV carbon frame, that's optimum compaction, low void. It's kind of the Trek acronym they've used for their carbon fibre for decades now, particularly in the top tube and the down tube and the seat tube on the bike and on the seat stays. But they've also completely remodeled all the tube shapes in the bike. So they've done that through sort of feedback from athletes, feedback on production frames in terms of what's lasted and where there's been stress signs, and also a complete remodeling in terms of FEA, finite element analysis on the different tubes through CAD software as well. And that saves them over 200 grams compared to the previous generation frame. So claimed weight on this bike is 1.95 kilos for a medium. So while it'll take a very carefully trained eye to see the differences up close, I mean, one of them is even slimmer seat stays on the back there, there are some more obvious differences as well. For a start, this isostrut suspension is now built by RockShox rather than Fox, and we'll go into detail on that a bit later. And the main pivot rises around 10 millimeters compared to the previous bike. And there's no knock block steering limiter in the back of the headset. Now, that not only saves them about 30 grams, but it also means that their riders can get the bars even lower. They can run a proper zero stack headset in there. And they found that most of their athletes weren't running knock block anyway, so it didn't seem much point in carrying it on. I did ask them if they tried adjustable geometry in the bike, and what they said was yes, they had. They built up an aluminium mule and then a carbon mule during testing, and they went backwards and forwards with different headsets that gave them up to 2 mil. They gave them up to 2 degrees in different head angle options, and it also let them change reach, and they kind of centered around 67.5 as the optimum sweet spot across all the bikes. And while they have added a small amount to the reach, it's pretty minimal. This large bike is now 460 mil, which is very similar to most 120 mil travel bikes, or at least dual travel bikes set up in their longer travel, but about 10 mil shorter than 100 mil bikes from other manufacturers. And also interesting, I did ask them whether they'd looked at steeper seat angles, but they said when they were trialling the mules, they looked at what the athletes were doing as soon as they got on the bikes. And when they put a steeper seat angle on, nearly all of them were actually pushing the seat backwards. So they've kept it around 74.5 degrees in terms of the seat angle. The other thing they've kept is a press fit bottom bracket at PF92. To be fair, press fit bottom brackets last a lot better than they used to, especially with the new dub standard from SRAM, which means you get a metal bearing outer and it sits in a plastic cup now. So there's not the sort of direct bearing into frame issues as they meant to be. And also Trek said, because it's a much wider bottom bracket shell there, they can make the down tube wider, they can make the seat tube wider and the main pivot wider, which all means a much stiffer frame for the same weight, or in this case, a frame that's still as stiff as the Generation 1 Supercaliber, but significantly lighter. And then at the back, you've got SRAM's UDH derailleur hanger, taking that T-type transmission mech there. We'll have a quick chat about the spec in a minute. And that's across all bikes. And then up front, they've stayed with external cable routing. They haven't bothered with internal headset routing. It's something that Trek really aren't into on their mountain bike side. And they also said, while some manufacturers seem to claim some weight loss benefits from routing the cables through the headset, they were so negligible they'd rather stick with the servicing convenience of conventionally routed cables. However, on this SLR frame, there's an SL frame, which is about 235 grams heavier. On this SLR frame, you aren't getting any internal cable trunking, because that does add a noticeable amount of weight. And obviously, if you're running axis, like this bike is, and there's another bike with an axis gear set and an axis seat post, then you've got these sort of worm cast pipes running through the frame that aren't even being used. So instead, they just have an entry and an exit port, and then there's foam sheaths within the bike to stop it sounding like a rattle can as you're going down descents. And then the final bit of geometry is they've actually lengthened the chainstay slightly and raised the bottom bracket, because you're now getting a 45mm stroke out of this isostrut, which gives you 80mm of travel at the rear rather than 60mm before, and it's 110mm travel fork at the front. But going back to that geometry change, you can run 100mm fork, or you can run 120mm fork in this bike. So there's a way to sort of massage the geometry to taste just by switching out the air spring on this to drop it slightly, or moving to the SID Ultimate fork rather than this SID SL Ultimate fork, which gives you an option of up to 120mm of travel. And incidentally, while we're talking about this SID SL, this is the lightest fork in RockShox's range, but it does mean that this bike comes with a relatively narrow 54mm wide, so that's 2.1 inch in reality, although they're listed as a 2.2 versions of this new Bontrager St. Anne RSL tyre. And this is the only bike that comes with a 2.2 rather than a 2.4. And you can see there's actually a pair of 2.4s on the workbench there, ready to go on after I've shot this video, because it's only the fork restriction on the front with that SID SL that means it runs the smaller tyres, and you know, they're lighter as well, so it means they can hit that headline sub 10 kilo weight. Because if you look at the back, there's a ton of mudroom, even with a significantly bigger tyre. And while we're on the subject of spec, you can see it's pretty much complete SRAM XXSL. So that's the lightest version of SRAM's new T-type transmission. It's not a power crank on there, it's a conventional crank running a 34 tooth, but it'll actually take up to a 38 tooth chainring on this bike for the sprinters and muscle Marys out there. And one of the reasons they've lifted that main pivot is to increase the anti-squat, because if you run a larger chainring, that actually reduces the effective anti-squat. So in some bikes where you've got a low anti-squat, the bigger you go with the chainring, which when you're putting more power through, so the bike is more likely to move under pedal pressure, which is what anti-squat is counteracting, you're actually getting less anti-squat in the bike. So more powerful riders will get a mushier feel, which is pretty much exactly what you don't want. So it's great to see Trek, you know, realising that that's a priority for proper performance riders, who this bike is obviously aimed at, that they need a really good pedalling platform mechanically from that new anti-squat. And I have to say, this thing pedals like an absolute demon. There are no watts wasted. And then at the back, you've got that XXSL derailleur with the carbon fibre cages there for minimum weight. You've got the new T-type cassette, the lightest version of that. And then looking over the far side, we've got level 4-pot ultimate brakes. Now you might think it's a bit weird running 4 pots on a Superlight race bike. You'd presume they'd go for a 2-pot brake. But actually, fun fact people, I may have said this before, that 4-pot is actually 10 grams lighter than the 2-pot. And good to see they've gone for the lighter weight alloy centre spiders on these centre lock rotors rather than the HS rotors, which are really, really heavy. I mean, they're thicker and they give slightly more power, but they're really, really heavy. And then you've got your SRAM controller pod just mounted onto the back of the levers there. Now that does mean, because you've got dual lockout and because it's a cabled Fox transfer dropper post, all bikes come with a dropper post, so that's a very good thing. And this is pretty much the lightest dropper post you can get, so that's why they've gone with this sort of Fox RockShox mix. It does mean, without internal cable routing, you have got a ton of cables thrashing around on the front here. So obviously racers are going to have the benefit of being able to hide them with numbers, but because you've got that twin position lockout there on the grip, on the twist lock grip, and you've got your brakes, and you've got your dropper post, there's a very, very busy cockpit. But as you can see, on that twist lock, it is just a 2-position. It's not the 3-position lockout that I've been running on my Cervelo, or if you've seen the separate Sid Lux video I've done. So you've just got open and then lock positions on the fork and the shock shaft at the back. But as you can see, this is the latest, lightest Sid SL with that machine crown. And I've just come round to the far side, so you can see you've got sag markers on the shock there, so it's relatively easy to set up. I would say because it's low pressure, it is a little bit notchy to set up at first. The more you cycle the shock, the smoother it is to set up and the easier it is to hit the correct sag. And then you've got 10 clicks of rebound adjustment on there, you've got your air pressure there, and then you've got the entry point for the remote there. And then as we go down to the bottom bracket, you can really see the breadth of that chainstay coming across there, a little bridge in front of the main pivot, how wide the main pivot is compared to a lot of XC bikes. And there's that press fit bottom bracket in there, which allows all this width and stiffness and clearance there on the rear tyre. But you can still run a 168mm Q factor crank if you want the narrowest crank width possible, which I know is going to be a thing for some of you racers out there. And then on top of this lightest possible dropper, you've got this super light Bontrager saddle, complete with carbon fibre rails, Aeolus RSL. I mean, I'd normally think of that as a road saddle, but it's actually really comfy off-road, so I might be asking Trek for one of those just to put on my own complete bike. And then you've probably already noticed, you've got these beautiful Bontrager Race Shop Limited all-in-one carbon bar and stem. As you can see, really deep negative on that. I think it's a -12. And quite a long extension on the stem as well. It's equivalent to about an 80-90mm in terms of reach. So relatively old school compared to the 60 or 70mm stems you might see on some bikes in this category. But again, that comes from feedback from the racers. And then we've talked about the tyres. But you're getting these Covey RSL wheels, which again, really nice features in there. You've got a little, blip there for your valve. They're slightly asymmetric, but most importantly, despite the fact they've still got 29mm internal rim and they come with a 2-year sort of crash damage warranty, they only weigh in at an actual weight. I mean, I think they say they're under 1200 grams, but the actual weights I've seen are 1245 grams for this wheel, but essentially a hyper light wheel. And if we go to the back here, you'll be able to see that it's a really fast pickup from that DT Swiss Ratchet EXP driver in there. So, super light wheel set with super light tyres with barely any tread on them. And I can tell you, with that low dynamic rotating weight and an all-in weight for this large without pedals and without those bottle cages on, 9.75 kilos, this thing absolutely flies in terms of acceleration and rolling speed and just, climbing. It's an absolute rocket ship. And again, that's where this ISO strut design really comes in to the performance of this bike. I went through a load of questions with Travis and Alex from Trek. And soon as at the end, I haven't really addressed the big sort of elephant in the frame, which is why go with ISO strut when so many other brands are just doing the conventional flex stay, shock underneath top tube, little linkage, like the new Cervelo, like the Blur, like the Pinarello, like pretty much every other bike since... I think the first time I saw it in the 29, it was actually the old Gary Fisher Hi-Fi, which was a Trek branded product. And what they gain from this setup is, although the shock is actually, because it's a whole strut running from there to there, it's not a conventional shock. It's it's based around the Sid Lux, so it's got Sid Lux internals. And interestingly, because it's a 38mm diameter shaft, it actually uses the bushings and some of the hardware in terms of seals are the same as the Zeb heavy-duty single crown fork from RockShox. So there's some good parts commonality there if you're looking for spares well away from your Trek dealer if you're racing abroad or something like that. So that's a real gain from working with RockShox on this, as well as the tuning they were able to put into this new ISO strut system. But circling back to the original point, they say compared to a linkage setup, with the different stays and the extra pivots and things on something like the top fuel, this saves over 200 grams. But almost more importantly, it gives them that proper, fully triangulated setup in terms of the stiffness from front to back of the frame. Because obviously this whole sort of, I don't even know how you describe it, the front of the seat stays slide backwards and forwards in its entirety, and it's locked at both ends of the frames. So that's a proper structural member on this bike. So I mean, you can tell the minute you press on the pedals, this thing is super rigid. I mean, it properly hurls itself out of corners and up climbs. It really is stand out stiff compared to your average full suspension cross country bike in this weight category. Because obviously, you know, you could get a hardtail easily a kilo lighter than this from someone like Scott or Bayer or Specialized or Canyon or Mondraker or Uno or, you know, the other people I've probably forgotten off that list. Or you could even get, you know, Trek's Procaliber is around 900 grams lighter than this frame. Because like I said, this frame is 1950 grams claimed weight. So, you know, you have got to ask the question, why aren't you using a hardtail? But I think when you watch the live ride review, you'll see how this shock works and how the whole bike works together, and you'll realise why this is, you know, why this is the choice of riders like, you know, Yolanda Neff, who won the Olympics on it. Evie Richards has won the World Championship on it, and yeah, it's designed as Trek's all-in-one race package. I did ask them if they were thinking of putting another bike in between this bike at 80 mil travel and then the top fuel, which is now basically a trail bike at 120 mil travel, and they said no, this is it. Now we've got more travel, we're perfectly happy that this bike covers every eventuality, from, you know, short course sprint or even that relay that was on the other day on the World Champs where it's just flat out for a lap, to full-on marathon. And a lot of that comes with just varying the sag in the shock on there. You know, I've run it anywhere between about 20% and 30%, and it really does make a big difference because it's such a low leverage setup. I'm only running around 100 to 110 PSI to get those figures. So 60% what you run in a conventional shock. And also because of the way the kinematic works, it's not only really low leverage, but it's really linear. And that's deliberately so Trek can get quite a high breakaway force initially, but then a really, really smooth transfer through the sensor. And they've also increased the leverage slightly, so it is more sensitive off the top and then more progressive at the bottom. And you can add bottomless tokens to it to increase progression, but I have to say I found it absolutely spot on once I'd worked out the right numbers. The only thing I would say is, and I think a lot of this comes from the fact they're using Zeb bushings in there, because that fork takes at least 10 hours of really, really hardcore riding to properly start to get it to loosen up, is this bike does still feel a bit stubborn and nutty because I've only put a few hours into it so far. So I'm going to change the tyres out, like I say, and then jump onto it again tonight. And I imagine that's going to make the whole back end feel a lot more supple. But at the end of the day, this is a ferociously focused race bike. And then to finish off, let's just have a look. And that glorious, translucent, cherry red finish over that unidirectional carbon fibre. And it actually comes in 3 colourways, but this red and black one is the lightest. And in terms of spec, you've got 3 different SRAM bikes on the SLR frame. Then you've got 2 different Shimano bikes as well, XTR and XT. All the SRAM bikes are Axis wireless. Obviously, Shimano bikes are still cabled, so you've got your digital or your analog options there. And then there are there's a 9.7 and a 9.6 Supercaliber, which use the heavier frame. It's roughly the same weight as the old frame. It gets internal cable trunking and a slightly less expensive layup and other things like that. Same mould, same shock, but it just makes it that bit much more affordable. And they go down to a Dior SLX spec to really get you onto this platform early if you're a privateer racer who's looking at this bike as an upgrade. And I have to say, as a purebred race bike, I think it's brilliant. It's not designed to be as versatile as these sort of 100 to 120 mil flip sort of XC downcountry bikes. This is a proper
pure racer. But that means, whereas those bikes can feel a bit flexy and a bit baggy if you start to use them for, real endurance or epic events, or even that probably might even be classified as, tough gravel events, they can feel a bit too much. This bike would certainly be super suitable for that kind of riding, and I'm really looking forward to hanging onto it for as long as possible and getting some proper epics into it, starting from tonight, to be honest.
So I hope that's given you a useful insight into this bike from a structural spec, geometry and design reasoning point of view. Like I say, if you want to know how this bike rides, then make sure you watch the live ride review, where I'll not only talk about how this rides and why it rides like that, but also how it compares to bikes like the latest Cervelo ZFS 120mm travel bike and the epic World Cup from Specialized, which obviously this bike shares a lot of similarities in terms of outline with, but obviously Trek were there first with this Supercaliber layout. But if there's anything I've missed out, obviously get busy in the comments. I'd love to know what you guys think about whether this bike is something that interests you, or whether you prefer a different sort of bike, or whether you'd like to see something else from Trek. I don't know. I mean, I'm definitely going to be watching the short course this afternoon up in Glasgow, and then watching the XCO later this week to see how the debut of this bike goes. Hopefully it'll be a success for Trek, because they clearly put a ton of work into this new bike. I mean, I know that they put at least 20 different tunes for this rear shock to try and get just the right ride feel at the back end. And Alex, who's kind of the design lead on it, actually moved to Durango so he could be with some of the Trek Factory Racing team to get that full-on, hands-on feel with development mules in alloy and carbon. So it's a really, really in-depth design process, because Trek have always been super involved in racing ever since kind of Gary Fisher jumped on board in the early 90s. He'd always been a advocate of race teams running your product and, race it on Sunday, sell it on Monday, the old mantra there. And it's something that Trek have adopted wholeheartedly, and sponsoring some of the best bike races in the world. So watch this on telly with some of the world's best and fastest riders on it, or watch this on YouTube with me on it, including a crash that proves I'm not one of the best riders, and quite a lot of uphill footage, which certainly proves I'm not one of the fastest riders, but I do know what I'm talking about when it comes to bikes. So massive thanks to Trek for sending the bike in pre-embargo so I can introduce it to you bang on time. They've also sponsored these videos, but hopefully you'll realise this is as honest as I can be from the bike, with my sort of reviewing experience back over all those years, and adding some insight from chatting to the Trek team as well. Massive thanks to Zero Cycling, to Torque, to Enduro Bearings, to Petey's Products, to Hebtroco and Crud XL Fenders for sponsoring the channel. Huge thanks to my Patreon supporters who subscribe on a monthly basis through the Patreon site, and they get exclusive ad-free edits of all these videos as a thank you, and kind of more in-depth buying advice through the comments on that platform. So if you really like what I'm doing with the channel, then please consider supporting me via Patreon. But subscribe, click for notifications so you know when the next videos are coming up, and give this a big thumbs up like if you've enjoyed it. And if you think your mates will enjoy it, then tell them as well, because you spreading the word about Guy Kes TV is by far the best way to get it to grow. But for now, I've been Guy Kestevan on Guy Kes TV, talking about the tech and the design behind Trek's brand new Generation 2 Supercaliber SLR 9.9 spec. So, time to put the bigger tyres on, torque bottles in, and go hit the trails again in a uniquely designed, seriously focused speed machine fashion.